The folder didn't exist on any public index. It surfaced by accident, tucked inside a municipal server scheduled for deletion, its timestamp older than the system that held it. The title was blunt, almost taunting, and the permissions were stranger still. Each file could only be opened from within a specific geographic boundary, as if truth itself had been fenced off. For cases. For regions. Each marked resolved, yet none concluded. What bound them together wasn't blood or spectacle, but a quiet precision that suggested intent. People weren't just harmed, they were edited out. Names redacted beyond recognition, addresses replaced with blank coordinates, photographs reduced to static. Reading felt like trespassing into a room that had been cleaned too thoroughly, the air still heavy with what had been removed. The deeper the narrator went, the clearer it became that these weren't failures of justice but successful executions of a system designed to contain damage by containing belief. Each case challenged a different assumption about humanity, mercy, accountability, innocence, and memory, and each did so without asking for permission. The files didn't threaten, they invited. And that invitation felt more dangerous than any warning. The first case required presence, not permission. The file would not open until the device crossed an invisible boundary along a stretch of coastline rarely visited except by fishermen and emergency crews. The narrator learned this the hard way, watching the document remain inert despite valid credentials, then flicker alive the moment the signal tower switched. There was no splash screen, no warning, just a list of timestamps and a single property identifier that refused to resolve to an address. The house had no name on record, only a designation tied to flood management maps, an area marked unsafe and long evacuated after a storm that officially claimed fewer than a dozen lives. Unofficially, the numbers never aligned. Missing persons reports spiked for 3 consecutive seasons, then quietly flattened, not because people stopped disappearing but because the reports stopped being filed. The file contained internal correspondence explaining the discrepancy in neutral language, citing voluntary relocation, duplicate identities, and data contamination, phrases repeated so often they lost meaning and became a kind of lullaby for bureaucratic conscience. Witness statements formed the spine of the case, though each one felt incomplete, as if trimmed to fit a predetermined conclusion. Neighbors described seeing lights in the house during evacuation curfews, silhouettes moving behind curtains weeks after utilities were cut, a smell of cooking carried on salt air when no one was supposed to be there. None of these accounts were treated as alarming. The investigators logged them as stress responses, grief projections, environmental hallucinations. One officer noted in his personal addendum that he felt relief every time he closed the file for the day, an unearned calm that settled in his chest like permission to forget. That note was later struck from the record, but the narrator could still see its ghost in the metadata, a deletion that left behind a timestamp without text. The only individual who refused the language of reassurance was a maintenance contractor assigned to inspect condemned structures for erosion damage. He entered the house multiple times over a 6-month period and reported inconsistencies that could not be explained by weather or vandalism. Rooms appeared to shift their proportions, corners that had been sharp now softened, staircases that required an extra step to reach the landing. He marked measurements on a clipboard, then returned to find the marks gone, the walls unscarred. Photographs he took developed incorrectly, the interior smeared as if the camera had moved, though he insisted it hadn't. When pressed, he described the sensation of being corrected by the space, as though the house resented being mapped. His supervisors advised rest and reassignment, framing concern as kindness. He declined, insisting on finishing the job. 2 days later, he submitted a hand-drawn floor plan that contradicted every official blueprint on file, corridors looping where none should exist, a central room without doors that he claimed he never entered but always felt himself circling. The plan was scanned, attached, then flagged as unreliable. Within hours, the contractor amended his statement, apologized for wasting time, and requested transfer inland. His badge access was revoked before he could return to the site. The final walkthrough documented in the case was conducted by 3 officials and a local liaison. Their notes were precise to the point of sterility. No debris. No signs of struggle. Furniture present but generic, as if selected from memory rather than taste. A calendar on the wall displayed the wrong year, but that anomaly was dismissed as oversight. Audio logs from the visit contained long stretches of silence punctuated by breathing, the microphones capturing presence without speech. At one point, a voice asked if they should keep going. No one answered. The question hung in the recording until the timestamp advanced and the next entry began. After the walkthrough, the recommendation was unanimous: restrict access permanently under environmental hazard statutes, reroute foot traffic, remove the structure from future inspection cycles. The rationale emphasized safety, not secrecy. It was framed as protection for the public, and that framing carried the day. What unsettled the narrator most was not the implication that people entered the house and did not return, but how effectively the case neutralized the instinct to care. Every mechanism was calibrated to reduce emotional friction. There was no villain to prosecute, no dramatic failure to correct, only a slow smoothing of concern until curiosity dulled. The region lock ensured that only those physically present could engage with the material, transforming distance into disbelief. Outside the boundary, the story collapsed into abstraction. Inside it, the weight of proximity pressed down, making prolonged attention feel burdensome, even unnecessary. The narrator understood then that the house was less an instrument of confinement than a filter. It did not need to trap everyone. It only needed to keep enough people tired, enough officials compliant, enough witnesses willing to accept the comfort of not knowing. The system didn't erase truth outright. It let truth remain, just far enough away that belief became optional, and optionality did the work of disappearance without noise, without resistance, without anyone needing to decide where the missing had gone. The second case did not require travel so much as timing. The region lock was temporal, opening only during a narrow window tied to a local event that occurred once a year, a memorial nobody outside the area could explain clearly. When the narrator finally accessed the file, it unfolded as a series of interviews conducted over a decade, all centered on a single witness whose name had been replaced with a rotating identifier that changed between documents. This witness was the only person to speak openly about what happened in a manufacturing town that lost an entire night. According to official records, there had been a power failure followed by minor unrest, resolved before dawn. According to the witness, the night never ended properly. Sirens looped without source, clocks stalled at different minutes, and people moved through the streets as if following instructions they could not hear. The witness described seeing neighbors guided into buildings they had never entered before, doors closing behind them with a gentleness that felt deliberate. No violence, no shouting, just a collective obedience that frightened more than chaos ever could. The interviews were calm to the point of unease. The witness spoke with careful precision, correcting investigators when they tried to supply words like panic or fear. Instead, they insisted the prevailing emotion was relief. People seemed grateful to be told where to go, grateful to surrender the burden of choice for a few hours. When morning came, the town resumed its routines, but certain individuals were gone. Not missing in the legal sense, not reported absent by employers or families, simply unaccounted for in memory. Photographs from before the event showed faces that no one could later identify. School records listed students whose classmates had no recollection of sharing a room with them. The witness remembered because they had resisted the pull that night, staying awake, refusing to follow the subtle cues that guided everyone else. That resistance, they claimed, marked them. From that point on, they noticed how easily conversations bent away from the subject, how questions slid off people like water, how even they themselves felt an urge to soften details when recounting the story. The case file revealed a pattern of containment that unfolded with remarkable speed. Within weeks, external agencies reclassified the event as a psychological anomaly triggered by infrastructure failure. Grants were issued for community wellness. Counselors arrived, then left. The witness was encouraged to participate in group sessions where their account was reframed as survivor's guilt. Each reframing was documented as progress. When the witness pushed back, insisting on the physical reality of what they had seen, the language around them shifted. Notes began to describe fixation, rumination, difficulty letting go. The witness was not threatened or silenced. They were supported into irrelevance. Their testimony remained on file, technically preserved, but buried beneath layers of interpretation that rendered it inert. Years passed before the witness broke their silence again, this time reaching out directly through an encrypted channel referenced obliquely in the file. The narrator could see the exchange, a short message asking whether anyone still remembered the names that had vanished, followed by a longer one describing new disturbances. The memorial event had started to change. Attendance was shrinking, rituals simplified, speeches shortened. People arrived late and left early, as if drawn by habit rather than conviction. The witness feared that once the last traces of remembrance faded, whatever had taken the missing would no longer need the town at all. The reply from the investigator was cautious, empathetic, non-committal. They scheduled a meeting. The timestamp indicated it was set for the following afternoon. The meeting never happened. The witness failed to appear, and attempts to reach them were logged as unsuccessful but unremarkable. A follow-up note stated that the witness had relocated voluntarily, pursuing privacy and closure. No forwarding address was provided. What caught the narrator's attention was not the disappearance itself but the efficiency with which it was absorbed. There were no frantic emails, no escalation. The system behaved as though it had been expecting this outcome. Subsequent references to the witness shifted to past tense, then to abstraction, their role reduced to initial source. The encrypted channel went dark. The region lock closed until the next memorial cycle, sealing the case behind a rhythm of remembrance that grew thinner each year. In the margins of the file, the narrator found a single anomaly, an audio clip attached without description. It contained ambient sound from the town square during the memorial, recorded after the witness vanished. Wind moved through flags. Shoes scuffed pavement. A speaker cleared their throat, then paused. In that pause, beneath the ordinary noise, there was a murmur that rose and fell like a crowd responding to cues no one could hear. The narrator listened repeatedly, trying to isolate words, but none emerged. What remained was the impression of agreement, of many people consenting at once to forget something together. The second case did not shatter faith through cruelty or spectacle. It did so by revealing how willingly humanity accepts erasure when it arrives dressed as relief, how silence can spread not by force but by comfort, and how a single voice can be made to disappear simply by being listened to, documented, and then gently set aside until even the absence feels earned. The third case resisted narrative in a way the others did not. There was no central location to travel to, no singular witness whose voice carried the weight of truth. Instead, the region lock fragmented access across several jurisdictions, each revealing a different slice of an investigation that appeared, at first glance, unrelated. Only by opening the files in a specific sequence did the pattern emerge, and even then it announced itself quietly, through repetition rather than revelation. The cases were catalogued under different crimes: abuse of authority, unlawful detainment, falsification of records, procedural negligence, but the details aligned with unsettling precision. In each instance, the harm inflicted was almost incidental. What mattered was what followed, the removal of the person not just from the present, but from the story of what had happened to them. The earliest file described a young woman detained briefly during a routine checkpoint in a border town. She was released without charge within hours, according to official logs. Her family later reported that she returned home altered, not traumatized in any visible way, but strangely compliant, unwilling to discuss the detention and eager to correct anyone who framed it as mistreatment. Medical evaluations found nothing wrong. Within months, she moved away, cut contact, and changed her name. The investigation closed with a finding of no misconduct. In another region, a man filed a complaint after being held overnight for questioning related to a financial discrepancy. Surveillance footage confirmed his presence in the holding area, calm, uninjured. The next day, he withdrew the complaint in person, praising the professionalism of the officers involved. 2 weeks later, he resigned from his job, vacated his apartment, and left no forwarding information. His employer noted a polite farewell email that contained no personal details, as if written by someone unfamiliar with his life. As the narrator cross-referenced the files, a method took shape, one that relied not on overt violence but on subtle recalibration. The individuals were subjected to an experience that did not break them but hollowed something essential. There were no visible scars, no legal thresholds crossed that would trigger scrutiny. Instead, each person emerged with a pronounced aversion to conflict, a heightened desire to agree, to smooth over discrepancies, to remove themselves from narratives that required friction. Psychologists consulted in the cases used language like dissociation and stress response, but the recommendations were always the same: no further action needed. The system did not punish. It adjusted. The most chilling aspect was the consistency of the aftermath. Families described loved ones who became courteous to the point of absence, who apologized for existing, who simplified their lives until there was nothing left to examine. Friendships dissolved without argument. Social media accounts were deleted or left to stagnate. Official records were updated to reflect moves, resignations, voluntary withdrawals. Each step was documented, each exit clean. The region locks ensured that no single authority could see the whole process. Each jurisdiction handled its piece, satisfied that the outcome was benign. Only by assembling the fragments did the narrator see the shape of an erasure that did not rely on secrecy so much as dispersion. One file contained an internal memo that should not have been accessible. It outlined a training module focused on de-escalation through compliance induction. The language was careful, framed as reducing harm and preserving dignity. Trainees were instructed to avoid confrontation, to create environments where subjects felt understood, relieved, eager to cooperate. There was a section on exit facilitation, advising on how to support individuals in making life changes that would minimize residual impact. Nowhere did it suggest coercion. Nowhere did it mention disappearance. Yet the outcomes mirrored one another too closely to dismiss. The narrator noted that the memo was distributed across regions under different program names, each tailored to local regulations, each innocuous in isolation. Attempts to challenge these practices within the files were rare and short-lived. A junior auditor flagged an unusual cluster of voluntary withdrawals and relocations, suggesting a review. The response thanked them for their diligence and reassigned them to a different department. Their concern was noted, then absorbed. Another document referenced a civil lawsuit that never materialized, the plaintiff withdrawing days before filing, citing personal growth and a desire to move on. The pattern was self-healing, correcting deviations before they could harden into accusations. What shattered the narrator's faith was not the existence of such methods, but the ease with which they were justified. The files framed outcomes as successes: no injuries, no complaints, no public distrust. Metrics improved. Community relations strengthened. The cost was borne quietly by individuals who ceased to insist on their place in the world. The narrator realized that this was the connective tissue between the cases, the shared method of erasure that replaced brutality with benevolence. Violence left evidence. These methods left gratitude. And gratitude, once documented, became a shield against further inquiry. The region locks were not barriers to hide wrongdoing but lenses to narrow perception, ensuring that each observer saw only a harmless slice. When assembled, the picture was unmistakable: a system that removed people by teaching them to remove themselves, that maintained order by convincing its subjects that absence was preferable to resistance, and that relied on humanity's preference for comfort over confrontation to make disappearance feel like a personal choice rather than a consequence imposed by design. The fourth case was the one the narrator hesitated to open, not because of what it might reveal, but because of what it seemed to demand in return. Unlike the others, the region lock did not correspond to a place or a time. It responded to behavior. The file remained inaccessible until the narrator noticed a pattern in the access logs: users who spent longer periods reviewing prior cases, who revisited certain passages repeatedly, were granted entry. Curiosity alone was not enough. The system appeared to measure persistence, fixation, a willingness to sit with discomfort without seeking resolution. Only after days of rereading did the lock release, as if acknowledging a threshold crossed. The opening screen contained no case summary, only a question embedded in the code, unrendered by the interface but visible in raw text, asking what the narrator believed justice was for. The documents that followed dismantled the assumption that the previous cases had been locked to prevent exposure. Instead, they suggested the locks were tests, designed to filter readers based on how they engaged with uncertainty. This case analyzed internal studies conducted across multiple regions, comparing public response to disclosures of wrongdoing when access was limited versus when information was widely available. The findings were blunt. When truth was contained, belief intensified among those inside the boundary and evaporated outside it. Skepticism grew with distance. Outrage required proximity. The locks were not about hiding facts but about shaping who felt compelled to act on them. The system relied on a predictable human tendency. When confronted with information that challenged moral self-image, people looked for reasons not to look too closely. Barriers provided those reasons, transforming avoidance into a rational choice. The case included transcripts from focus groups where participants were told about events resembling the first 3 cases, presented with varying degrees of access restriction. Those given full access expressed horror and a desire for accountability, but their engagement waned quickly, replaced by fatigue and cynicism. Those told that certain details were restricted reacted differently. They speculated, filled gaps with imagination, and held on to belief longer. Yet belief without agency curdled into resignation. The studies concluded that the most stable outcome was not outrage or denial, but a quiet acceptance that some things were not meant to be known. That acceptance, once internalized, protected institutions more effectively than secrecy ever could. What unsettled the narrator was the implication that they themselves were now part of the experiment. By persisting, by crossing thresholds, they had demonstrated a tolerance for ambiguity that the system valued. The file documented how readers who reached this stage often reported a shift in perspective. They stopped asking who was responsible and began asking whether responsibility was even useful. Moral clarity blurred into intellectual curiosity. The danger was not corruption of values but their dilution. Justice became an abstract concept, interesting but impractical. The case warned that prolonged exposure to unresolved truths without avenues for action led to disengagement, a self-protective numbing that felt like wisdom. Embedded in the file were reflections from analysts who had designed the locks. They wrote candidly about faith in humanity as a variable that could be stressed and measured. People did not lose faith when confronted with cruelty, one note argued, but when they realized how easily they could be convinced to tolerate it. The locks forced readers to confront their own limits. At what point did they stop pushing? At what point did they decide knowing was enough? The system did not need to silence everyone. It needed only to identify those who would silence themselves once the cost of caring exceeded the comfort of distance. The final section of the case was a mirror disguised as a report. It tracked the narrator's own interaction patterns in anonymized form, highlighting moments where they chose to pause, to step away, to rationalize delay. Each pause was framed as understandable. Each delay as healthy. The language was empathetic, almost kind. It acknowledged the weight of what had been learned and offered permission to disengage. The realization landed slowly and with more force than any prior revelation. The locks were not obstacles to overcome but invitations to stop. They tested belief not by challenging it directly but by exhausting it, by turning moral urgency into a prolonged, solitary vigil with no clear endpoint. In that vigil, faith eroded not because humanity was irredeemable, but because the systems built to manage harm understood that most people, given enough time and enough distance, would choose peace of mind over the burden of insisting that the world be better. The fifth case did not announce itself as final, but everything about it suggested an edge. The region lock opened without resistance, as if the system had already accounted for the narrator's arrival here, and the absence of friction was its own warning. There was no introductory context, no framing language to soften what followed. The file began mid-thought, a continuation rather than a beginning, and it assumed familiarity not just with the previous cases but with the mindset they cultivated. This case was not about an event or a location. It was about consequence. Specifically, what happened when the last lock was opened by someone who had not turned away. The materials documented a series of internal projections labeled outcome models, each describing the downstream effects of full pattern recognition. Analysts had mapped what occurred when disparate cases were finally understood as parts of a single mechanism. Contrary to expectation, exposure did not lead to mass upheaval. There were no riots in the models, no sweeping reforms. Instead, the dominant outcome was personal destabilization. Individuals who grasped the system in its entirety experienced a collapse of narrative coherence. They struggled to locate themselves ethically. If harm could be inflicted without malice, if erasure could occur through kindness and procedure, then the old categories of good and evil failed to apply. The model suggested that this realization produced paralysis rather than action. Case studies followed, anonymized but detailed, describing researchers, auditors, journalists who reached this stage. Each had pushed past the intended stopping points, assembled the fragments, and seen the whole. None were silenced directly. Instead, they drifted. One abandoned a long-running investigation to write fiction, later describing the choice as liberation. Another pivoted to teaching, focusing on abstract ethics rather than applied accountability. A third withdrew entirely from public life, citing burnout. The file treated these outcomes as successes. The system had functioned as designed. The truth had been seen, and seeing it had been enough to neutralize its threat. The narrator noticed a recurring phrase in the analyst notes: containment through comprehension. The idea was simple and devastating. Partial knowledge provoked outrage. Complete knowledge dissolved it. Once someone understood how deeply embedded the mechanisms were, how many ordinary decisions sustained them, the prospect of dismantling the system felt impossible without dismantling society itself. The final lock existed to deliver that understanding. It was not meant to be reached by many. Only by those already inclined to look past simple answers. And once reached, it ensured they would carry the weight alone. Near the end of the file was a section marked Post-Access Effects. It detailed subtle changes observed in those who opened the final case. Sleep disturbances. A heightened awareness of language, especially euphemism. An aversion to definitive statements. Most striking was the loss of urgency. Subjects reported feeling that exposure itself was the endpoint, that further action would be redundant or even irresponsible. One quote stood out, attributed to a reader who could have been the narrator themselves: "Knowing changes nothing if everything depends on people choosing to care, and people can always choose not to." The consequence, then, was not punishment but inheritance. By opening the final case, the narrator became a carrier of an understanding that could not be easily shared. The file warned that attempts to summarize or expose the system to others often failed, not because the information was disbelieved, but because it was too diffuse, too unsettling in its ordinariness. Without a single villain or event to anchor outrage, audiences disengaged. The truth slid off them, just as it had slid off institutions, leaving behind only discomfort. The system counted on this. It had evolved to a point where revelation was not a threat but a maintenance function, ensuring that those most capable of seeing the whole would also be the least capable of mobilizing against it. The final pages contained no data, only a log of access events ending with the narrator's own session. There was no directive, no warning to stop, no instruction on what to do next. The absence was deliberate. The consequence of opening the last case was not exposure to something forbidden, but the realization that nothing further would happen. No alarm would sound. No authority would intervene. The world would continue unchanged, and the burden of deciding what the knowledge meant would rest entirely on the person who now possessed it. The system did not need to lock the truth away anymore. It had already done its work by ensuring that anyone who reached this point would understand why most people never would, and why even fewer would try to change what they now saw clearly unfolding everywhere all the time.